It's December 1995, and France's president, François Mitterrand, is receiving treatment for prostate cancer in the Val-de-Grâce hospital in Paris. His days are numbered. Everybody knows that. So, in true Gallic style, he decides to have one last party, a gastronomic feast for 30 of his closest friends and family. The menu, chosen by the president himself, embodies the France of popular imagination, refined, rarefied, and elite. Top of the bill is the 2-ounce yellow-throated songbird, the ortolan, an illegal delicacy and protected species. Having been blinded and then fattened to 4 times their natural size, the ortolan's lives are extinguished when they're drowned in burning armagnac. After 8 minutes in a hot oven, the illicit birds are ready to serve, piping hot. Mitterrand and the assembled group cover themselves with linen shrouds, partly to keep in the aroma of their treat and partly to hide their appalling act from God. They then place the exquisite creature into their mouths, with its head dangling from between their lips, and begin to gorge themselves, munching on the tiny lungs, heart and delicate bones. They say that as your teeth sink into the ortolan's fragile flesh, you can taste the bird's entire life. The wheat of Morocco, the salt air of the Mediterranean, the lavender of Provence. Eating the bird is a symbolic act, likened to eating the very soul of France itself.
No thanks, not for me. What fascinates me here is the very Frenchness of this scene. It's impossible to imagine a British Prime Minister in the same position, wolfing down an illicit haul of quail's eggs with quite the same relish as Mitterrand brought to this final meal.
In eating this transgressive feast, he was breaking laws and taboos with the indifference of an emperor. But more than that, this bizarre banquet challenges our Anglo-Saxon naivety that food is a mere commodity. For our Gallic brothers, there are higher forces at work. In France, food has never just been about food, but involves a whole range of political, cultural, and even philosophical meanings.
What I want to know is why, for the French, food has taken on this role, and what it tells us about their identity and culture. But first, you might want to know what happened to Mitterrand.
Well, he enjoyed not one, but 2 of the tiny ortolan birds. They were the last food he ever ate. I've been travelling back and forth to France for nearly 25 years, as a tourist, a student, a journalist, and now a professor. Last year, I moved here permanently, and I got a bit of a shock. France is a society on the move, changing more rapidly than anywhere else in Europe. But the France of the 21st century, with its Americanized golf buggies, is a world away from the France where my journey begins. The land of Versailles, the spiritual center of French power politics, and the birthplace of French cuisine. Built for Louis XIV, the palace was intended as a showpiece, to prove to the world the supreme triumph of French civilization.
Encore, je sais, j'ai tort, on est si loin, je n'y comprends rien. Dieu marin et chimère.
The gardens, lights and mirrors are all shot through with a mixture of precision and grandeur, which says this is the nearest to heaven you will ever see on earth. It is surely one of the most fantastic monuments to human vanity ever created.
Ces jeux-là n'ont rien d'humain.
Louis XIV had an ego the size of the Titanic. He called himself the Sun King after an emblem on a shield that he wore parading around Paris. At the age of 23, he really thought he was a god. When his authority was briefly challenged, he galloped 6 miles to the Parliament, kicked open the door, cracked the whip, and declared, "I am the state."
Or in French, l'État c'est moi. From this point on, Louis decided that France would become the great nation it had always deserved to be. France would be the new Rome, the new cultural and religious capital of Europe.
Fuyant loin de la terre, je glisse hors de...
Under the Sun King, the Italian influences brought in by his grandmother Catherine de' Medici were out. Foppish Italianisms were replaced by a robust French style, which meant solid virtues in all walks of life. French manners, French fashion, French architecture, and of course, French cuisine.
Vrai. Les éléments en guerre au royaume.
To help him in his endeavour, he installed in his kitchen François-Pierre de la Varenne as his head chef.
Now, Varenne was not just a master cook. He was also the author of a seminal work on French cuisine called Le Cuisinier François, this book here. It's a book that shouts to the world, this is French cooking, and it's the best that you'll ever know. It was a book that was a call to arms and a badge of patriotic pride.
And with Varenne in the kitchen, Louis could engage in the daily theatre of conspicuous consumption. It was his will to dine alone. Well, sort of. He was actually in full view of about 300 of his sycophantic courtiers who would patiently watch their god eat. In the 1966 film La prise de pouvoir de Louis XIV by the Italian director Rossellini, the dining experience is stunningly recreated, with the eating of dinner turned into some kind of ritual communion between the Sun King and his scoff.
Je déconseille formellement le porc à votre majesté.
Bon. Qu'on apporte les œufs durs. Les œufs durs.
An average meal would include soup, pheasant, partridge, salad, mutton with gravy and garlic, 2 hanks of ham, cakes and fruit and jam, all washed down with a fine Burgundy wine. It would often last through the evening and into the next day.
Smashing, great. This is cooking and eating as an extreme sport. The point was, of course, to be overawed by the king's superhuman appetite and the endless fulfillment of his desires. But most crucially, this is the first time in history the food had been linked to power and the French state itself. All of this is making a great big statement. What it's saying is this is paradise and this man eats like a god.
Écoute les orgues, elle joue pour toi. Il est terrible, cette terre-là.
The pomp and grandeur surrounding Louis's feasts became so much a part of legend that all those associated with the court attempted to emulate their style if they wished to impress the king or curry favour.
Spécialement pour toi.
Most famous of all is the story of Vatel, the master chef of the Chateau of Chantilly, who in April 1671 was ordered to organise a meal for the Sun King and 2,000 of his closest friends. Now, Vatel had a reputation to keep up. He had, after all, invented the sublime, if sickly, Chantilly cream. In the sumptuous 2001 film Vatel, the chef is played brilliantly by Gérard Depardieu, who's seen overseeing the mighty feast. The meal in question was to be held on a Friday, with fish as the headline course. After all good Catholics eat fish on a Friday. But fish was a risky choice, as it had to come from over 100 miles away in Boulogne. And if the weather turned nasty, there'd be no fishing at all. A disaster. Vattel nervously waits for the fish to arrive. The suspense is unbearable. When he's told that there have been storms on the coast, he knows that his honour and his reputation are now in tatters.
I've lost my honour. It's a blow I cannot bear. I haven't slept for 12 nights. My mind is spinning. And with that, Vattel took a sword and stuck it into his left flank. And then he collapsed dead on the stone floor of his own kitchen.
The irony of this story is terrible. Shortly after the suicide of the unfortunate Vattel, an aide announces that the fish had, after all, arrived.
One of the guests, Madame de Sévigné, wrote in her diary with the steely gaiety of the upper classes. We talked, we walked, we supped and we hunted. Despite the loss of the chef, the dinner was excellent. It was all so very enchanting. Vattel's suicide was greeted by the aristocrats with a massive Gallic shrug of indifference because, well, that's just what artists do, isn't it?
But while a small elite in Paris and Versailles ate like gods, or sometimes pigs, in the rest of the country the dish of the day had not changed in centuries. Watery soup, greasy bread, a seasonal vegetable, and if times were good, a slice of pork fat. In this, the French weren't very different from us, or indeed their other continental neighbours. Where they differed was in their attempts to experiment with their diet, with anything they could find, even rats like these.
Very nice. To be fair, most of this experimental cooking was the result of desperation. During one of many famines in France, the poor made bread out of the bones of corpses from the local cemetery. They hallucinated, went mad and died. During another famine, a respectable bourgeoise roasted the carcasses of her two small children. They were already dead from hunger. She did this over 5 days, and on the 5th day, she died of melancholy. But, waste not, want not, her servant boiled the bones into a soup which fed the neighbours for another week.
Meanwhile in Paris, everybody knew that the court under the successive reigns of Louis XIV, Louis XV and Louis XVI had been gorging itself and wasting money as if it was going out of fashion. The target of the accumulated hate of the hungry was Marie Antoinette, the silly and vain queen who, it was alleged, had almost single-handedly ruined the French budget with her extravagant banquets and her excessive use of toiletries. Marie Antoinette is provocatively played here by the American actress Kirsten Dunst and is the perfect incarnation of the ditzy queen, who, when told that the French populace had no bread to eat, replies, "Qui mange de la brioche, or..."
Let them eat cake.
Marie Antoinette's famous remark, "Let them eat cake," has gone down in history as the supreme example of the stupidity and cruelty of the aristocracy. But there's more going on here than meets the eye. First of all, what she actually said was let them eat brioche. And secondly, brioche is not a cake at all. More to the point, it takes less flour to make one of these things a brioche than it does to make a loaf of bread. So, when you've got a flour shortage, it makes sense to eat brioche instead of bread. But in the tide of revolutionary ferment that was about to engulf all of France, no one wanted to hear common sense, and least of all, from a poor, silly foreign queen.
But the anger at the inequality within France wasn't really about bread or cakes. It was about a society bitterly split in two between the elite, literally in French, the chosen few, and a vast seething underclass that did well to survive the disease and hunger that were the staples of everyday life. And then, a few crossed words in a workers' bar, a rumour of wage cuts and price rises, and the city of Paris erupted into violence. The whole world knows the familiar tale of the revolution. The images of the angry masses, the storming of the Bastille and the guillotine. But the meaning of it all still causes arguments in France and abroad. Some see the revolution as the victory of the sans-culottes, of the slaves over the masters, a myth that most French people still believe, and one that's fueled many a left-wing revolution since 1789.
I don't see it that way at all. I see the revolution as the victory of the bourgeoisie over the rest of society. The middle classes emerged from the wreckage of revolution not only financially better off, but with that most prized possession, total political power. From now on, France would be ruled by butchers, bakers, merchants and lawyers.
By 1800, the French were tired of war and conflict, misery and hunger. They wanted order, peace, prosperity, and most of all, food. And they wouldn't have to wait for long. Before the revolution, there had only been a handful of places to eat out in France. But now, in the newly democratized country, the long French tradition of dining in restaurants was born. One of the grandest restaurants around was here at Le Grand Véfour, a place where power came to eat and play. Politicians and philosophers, mixed with military men and diplomats, all brought together in a decor that insisted upon the triumph of French civilization over all others. Here, the dream of Europe under French control was enacted in a menu that swept through meat, fish, and the finest pâtisserie, with all the brio and ruthless finesse of the French army on the march. The current head chef of Véfour is the 3 Michelin-starred Guy Martin.
Alors, Monsieur Martin, est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer les origines et l'histoire de ces restaurants?
L'histoire du Grand Véfour est complètement liée à la Révolution française. Donc la Révolution française, tous les grands cuisiniers, des comtes, des vicomtes, etc. se retrouvent pratiquement au chômage. Donc certains vont travailler dans des restaurants. Restaurant, c'est restaurer, c'est aller manger. Ouais. Commencent à ouvrir les premiers restaurants, mais qui n'ont rien à voir avec le restaurant d'aujourd'hui. C'est uniquement, ils servent d'abord des bouillons.
Oui, d'accord.
Et après, les restaurants commencent à s'ouvrir délicatement. Alors, par exemple, au Grand Véfour, à l'époque, dans les restaurants, vous choisissiez des plats et en même temps, vous pouviez choisir la dame qui allait vous accompagner.
C'est pratique quand même.
C'est pratique, c'est pratique.
Et est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer ces plats ici?
Bien sûr, c'est un vol au vent. Cette cuisine, d'après la Révolution, où on commence à mélanger différents ingrédients pour composer un plat. Vous avez des quenelles de brochet, des champignons, des riz de veau. Ce sont des plats copieux. Hein.
À l'époque, ça se voit.
Ça se voit. À l'époque, on mangeait énormément. C'est cette époque où on commence à s'intéresser à la gastronomie. C'est vraiment le départ.
D'accord.
So, there you go. Vol au vent, a revolution in puff pastry. One of the restaurant's clients was a young Corsican freedom fighter called Napoleon Bonaparte. A man who promised France order, security, and most importantly, la gloire. An almost untranslatable word which stirs patriotic Frenchmen to their souls and means glory or destiny. Under him, France would assume its rightful position as the leader of the world in every area of human activity, from philosophy to art, politics, and of course, cooking.
Now, no one's ever claimed that Napoleon was a gastronome. In fact, he was bored silly by food. Like a kid, he couldn't wait to get down from the table. He even boasted that he could finish any meal in 15 minutes. His tastes were equally childish. He liked macaroni, roast chicken. But although he was the very opposite of a foodie, Napoleon understood perfectly the cultural and political significance of food.
With this in mind, he instructed his foreign minister and grand gourmet, Talleyrand, also known as the first fourchette or fork of France, to find a suitable place to entertain. Talleyrand, on a mission, purchased the magisterial Château de Valençay on the Loire with 1.6 million francs of government money. He brought with him his own secret weapon, Marie-Antoine Carême, the godfather of French cuisine. I went down to the bowels of Valençay to talk to one of his disciples about Talleyrand, Carême and diplomacy.
Il conserve son château, n'est point atteint par la Révolution, sauf peut-être celle de la cuisine.
Est-ce qu'il y a une mission civilisatrice française ici? C'est la Révolution française à table.
Il est vrai, puisque le savez, enfin depuis la nuit des temps, la cuisine rejoint aussi les politiques. Et c'est vrai que le rôle de Carême fait en sorte qu'on invite des politiques du monde, de l'Europe entière, et construisons alors le monde de demain. Des grands chefs de cuisine en France ont traduit dans l'histoire et jusqu'au jour d'aujourd'hui que ceux-là ont toujours investi une forme de politique à travers leurs assiettes, puisque régaler l'étranger, c'est aussi presque l'affectionner.
Et c'est avec Carême aussi on voit les grandes sauces françaises.
Tout à fait.
Oui.
C'est la période où justement l'on va intégrer la farine au sein du beurre qu'allons faire fondre, le roux. Le roux, et ce roux va lier toutes les sauces. Ah, si jamais, hier, on liait à l'œuf, à la mie de pain, au beurre, là, on ajoute la farine qui justement va donner souplesse, épaisseur, amabilité donc à toutes nos formes de préparation.
Est-ce que Carême, il est le père de la cuisine française?
Et il est vrai, représente la cuisine de France, l'architecture qui est celle-ci, le beau, le bon, l'agréable à manger, évidemment.
Ah, bien.
As Napoleon did with his legions, Carême and Talleyrand's supreme achievement was to convince other nations of the inherent superiority of French cuisine. Their art was literally imperial propaganda on a plate.
All good dinner party hosts know one thing, that nothing seduces more effectively than a good meal. Well, Napoleon took this to new heights when he charged his chief diplomat Talleyrand and his cook Carême to go out and conquer Europe in culinary terms, just as he'd done with his own armies. So, at the Congress of Vienna, when Napoleon asked Talleyrand what he could do to secure more French votes, Talleyrand replied quite simply, more casseroles.
If Napoleon had eaten more of Carême's casseroles and less military rations, he may have been saved from the stomach ulcer that was to be his undoing. But his untimely death in 1821 did little to stop the now time-honoured French tradition of mixing food and politics. Something not lost on Bonaparte's nephew Napoleon III, who took over the reins of French power in 1852 after a short-lived return of the monarchy. Having turned Paris into the city we know today, with its cafes, boulevards and public squares, Napoleon Mark II commissioned the building of a huge food market in the centre of the capital. Les Halles, as it was known, was to be a showcase of the very best food in the known world. Les Halles was really the people's palace, a beautiful structure filled with fruit, vegetables, cheese, meat, wine from all over France, and all accessible to the working and drinking classes of the city. This was truly the democratic republic of food. Although demolished in the 1960s, you can still get a sense of layout here at Rungis, just outside Paris, which is in fact now the largest market of its kind in the world, larger than the state of Monaco itself. It's 2 in the morning, and between now and 4, most of the business here will be conducted. Massive aisles are set apart for fish, vegetables, and here, meat.
You can almost smell what Les Halles would have been like right here. This is what Émile Zola called the belly of Paris, a monstrous labyrinth, a stinking warren of dead ends, alleyways, always leading to a butcher's, a brothel, or a bar. The people round here had their own slang. A bico was a cafe, a copper was a fleek, a macro was a pimp. Gives you an idea of some of their priorities. It was a semi-criminal underworld which flourished at night, but the food was always superb.
Once tonight's trade was over, at about 5 a.m, the workers retired to the surrounding restaurants for a drink, a bowl of onion soup, snails and pig's trotters, in the simple but excellent restaurants all around. France, under Napoleon III, was living high. Money, food and drink flowed into the country from its burgeoning empire, stretching from North Africa to Indochina. And Paris became commonly known as the Queen of the World. And then the party ended, abruptly and without warning. Germany, the old rival to the east, had long coveted the disputed French territory of Alsace-Lorraine. In 1870, the Germans deliberately provoked the arrogant and really quite dim Napoleon into declaring war on Germany. He'd walked quite blindly into a deadly trap. The German armies quickly mobilized, and Prussian forces marched on Paris. The city managed to hold out for 4 months in the winter of 1870-1871, but had to resort to desperate methods. The rich found a new kind of sustenance when the cages of the zoo in the Jardin des Plantes were raided, and kangaroos, antelope and elephant began to appear on menus across the city. On the 25th of December 1870, one restaurant created a menu that would have appalled Noah and his fairy friends on the Ark.
For starters, there was butter, radish and sliced monkey brain. That was followed by red mashed beans and elephant soup. Then you got a choice, camel à l'anglaise, which is basically camel roasted in the English fashion, or you could have bear ribs and pepper sauce, wolf legs with venison, antelope pâté with truffles. Don't fancy any of that. I'm going to say it really quietly for obvious reasons. How about the kangaroo stew?
For most Parisians, the zoo menu was off limits. Haute cuisine safari style was simply too expensive. Instead, they had to do with simple domestic pets, cats, dogs, and the ever-adaptable rat. Butchers at the time were known to charge more for brewery rats, plumper and smelling of ale, than your average skanky sewer rat. Following a prolonged siege, the French capital fell on January the 28th, 1871, followed by an armistice. But despite the crushing defeat, losing the provinces of both Alsace and Lorraine, the French found a silver lining on the food front when a flood of refugees from the Lost Lands arrived in Paris, bringing with them local delicacies and tasty beer. The first beer pump was installed in Paris by the Alsatian Frédéric Beaufinger in his brand new restaurant here in the Bastille. It set a trend and a new kind of restaurant emerged, the brasserie.
Selling typical Alsatian dishes such as sauerkraut, renamed here in France choucroute, sausages and beer, these vast eating machines represented a kind of 19th century ideal of modernity. Beautifully decorated, spectacular in every sense. I can almost hear the noise and the bustle of 19th century Paris, what must have been the very engine room of the city. And there was also a big democratic spirit at work here. The very best of food within the reach of every single French citizen. Liberty and fraternity at their height.
By the 1890s, the convulsions of the recent past seemed a world away, as Parisians threw themselves into unbridled hedonism. This was the Belle Époque, when Paris became known throughout the world as the capital of pleasure. The 1890s city was also attracting the adjective decadent, a euphemism for specifically Parisian forms of excess: drink, sex, and food. President Émile Loubet, France's first president of the 20th century, was keen to join the party.
La nuit, tous les chagrins se grisent. De tout son cœur, on aimerait.
On the 22nd of September 1900, he masterminded the mother of all banquets here in the Tuileries Garden. 22,000 mayors from every part of France were summoned to celebrate the anniversary of the First Republic.
The food was served by maîtres riding around on bicycles. With 7 kilometres of tables to cover, as you can imagine, they had quite a workout. But the aim of the banquet was not just simply to feed the great and good of La Belle France, but also to make a public spectacle of it. Like the great feasts of Louis XIV, some 300 years earlier. The aim was to serve up, literally, la gloire on a plate.
Alors tu vois sur ta chemise que tu t'es mis tout près du...
The catering company behind this epic blowout is still with us today, and commanded by the esteemed Monsieur Biffy.
Est-ce que vous pouvez nous expliquer l'importance de l'an 1900?
L'an 1900, c'était aussi une volonté républicaine du chef de l'État de rassembler et de les réunir tous sous le même drapeau. On est sur un grand dîner qui est pour la gastronomie la Tour Eiffel, qui est la même valeur. C'est-à-dire qu'à ce moment-là, la République réunit ses maires et prend Potel et Chabot pour leur assurer le meilleur.
Donc c'était pour montrer au monde extérieur aussi bien que la France unie, et qu'est-ce que c'était la civilisation française, c'est ça, la démocratie.
La démocratie, dans cette réunion républicaine. C'est important le mot république en France.
C'est la démocratie en marche quand même.
C'est la démocratie en marche, mais 1900 c'est déjà des beaux produits, c'est une cuisine révélée, voilà.
Le meilleur de la France.
Un jarret de veau glacé, une technique de cuisson et de glaçage qui nous vient d'Antonin Carême, des beaux légumes, des truffes. C'est vraiment donner au pays ce qu'il y a de plus beau et les plus belles choses de cuisine.
C'est la France à la table.
Voilà. Notre cuisine arrive d'un aspect quasi militaire, c'est-à-dire que la cuisine est normée en saucier, en entremétier, en garde-manger. Et tous ces postes-là sont des gens qui ont un travail.
J'aime bien la métaphore militaire parce que c'est la grande armée révolutionnaire en marche, en fait.
Oui, mais vous savez, quand on dit on fait marcher la table 9, c'est oui chef, c'est pas s'il te plaît, est-ce que tu pourrais m'amener le tourne-dos avec la béarnaise. Donc effectivement, ces ordres-là font que des banquets comme les 20 000 sont possibles. Marie, vous vous occupez du lobster and chips. Romain, le foie gras. Qu'est-ce que c'est un banquet de 20 000 ? C'est pas un banquet de 20 000, c'est 200 banquets de 100. Ça finit par faire des petites équipes, des vraies brigades, et qui en plus vont avoir l'acharnement de faire un petit peu mieux que la cuisine d'à côté. Et donc c'est cette volonté de se surpasser toujours qui fait la force militaire d'une armée en campagne. Vous êtes tous prêts ?
Oui, chef!
What this banquet was all about was the supreme victory of French civilization. It showed that the French could pull off an almost impossible logistical feat with military precision and deadly elegance. More to the point, it celebrated the two qualities the French held dear to their hearts: civic democracy and fine cooking. What better, an unbeatable emblem of France. But the banquet was only part of Loubet's grandiose initiative to make Paris the centre of the world. In addition, the Grand and Petit Palais, the Pont Alexandre and the Gare de Lyon were all built. From the outside, the station evokes the Belle Époque fairly discreetly. But inside is another story altogether.
This is a place that began life rather humbly as the Gare de Lyon station buffet. But there's nothing either modest or humble about what's on offer here now. This restaurant, Le Trembleu, is the supreme incarnation of French self-belief and optimism at the beginning of the 20th century. It's about food, romance, gravy and glory, all rolled into one. It's a place that says, with no ifs and buts, we are the French and we rule the world. No room for understatement here.
France was now a very rich country with a vast empire. In this temple of gastronomy, it's all laid out. The empire brought home. The murals of Algeria, the Jura and Lebanon are not random images of foreign places to distract the traveller, but are there to map out the world of French civilization. And with the train, previously obscure and distant regions were brought into new prominence. Foodstuffs and wine came in from every corner of France, from the Auvergne to the Pyrenees. The advent of the train also brought a decentralisation of power and the beginning of mass transit for business and for fun. French travellers voyaged across their own country in search of new and exquisite gastronomic delights, savouring both the food and the lush, fertile ground that had produced it.
Route des vacances qui traverse la plus belle partie de la France, qui fait de Paris un petit faubourg Valence et la banlieue Saint-Paul-de-Vence.
The end of the 19th century was also the beginning of a new century of speed. The great new invention was the motor car, the Frenchman's personal chariot, which allowed him to set out and discover his native land anew. On the new little Route Nationale, the precursor of the motorway, it was now possible to set off from Paris in your newfangled automobile and literally taste your way through the country, armed with a useful new guide called Michelin. With this one historic publication, pride in Gallic technology and food were brought together, and in the now well-established French democratic tradition, made accessible to all.
No room, fat lad. The figure we know in English as the Michelin Man is known in French as bibendum, a beeb, and it's a term that's used in French to affectionately describe any fat bloke. The phrase comes from the Latin nunc est bibendum, now is the time to drink. And incredibly, one early guide for motorists advised the new knights of the road to take brandy or Belgian beer as a cure for tiredness on the new Route Nationale.
The best place to eat on the route, and arguably in all of France, is Lyon, a city made rich by the silk trade. It was said at the time that if Paris was the capital of the world, then Lyon was the real capital of France. It was a bastion of anti-Parisian ideas in food, as in all other things.
Lyon is home to some of the most delicious food in the world, but also some of the most disgusting. The staple diet is ears, feet, entrails, and for all I know, genitals. It's not a place where the phrase meat is murder holds much sway.
Even Edouard Herriot, Lyon's elected mayor from 1907, found that Lyonnais delicacies needed a little explanation. L'andouillette, a sausage made out of pig's stomach, is like politics, he said. It needs to smell of shit. Basically, he was saying you need a strong stomach for both. L'andouillette is certainly an acquired taste, but it was a favourite of the Lyon working class community known as the Canut, a community who earned their money as textile workers and packers and demanded to be fed properly and cheaply. And this is where the skill came in, making a meal from offal and the tougher bits of beef and veal. To learn more, I met up with the manager of the famous Au Lyonnais restaurant, Eric Mercier.
Et on dit très souvent que la cuisine lyonnaise, c'est le meilleur de la France. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on dit ça?
Je crois que c'est vrai déjà. Je crois que c'est vrai parce qu'il n'y a que des bons produits. Pourquoi? Parce que c'est pas très loin d'Italie, c'est pas très loin de la Suisse, c'est pas très loin de la Savoie, c'est pas très loin de la Bresse avec la volaille, c'est pas très loin de toutes les régions finalement, c'est assez centré.
Et quels sont les plats emblématiques de Lyon? Qu'est-ce que c'est un plat qui dit que là c'est une cuisine lyonnaise pour vous?
Alors déjà il y a plusieurs plats qui sont présentés ici qui sont typiquement lyonnais. La chose que tous les Lyonnais mangent toute la semaine, c'est la cervelle des canuts.
Ouais.
C'est du fromage frais,
Ouais.
avec des herbes fraîches,
Ouais.
de l'échalote et de
Ouais.
l'huile de noix.
Ouais.
Alors, la cervelle des canuts, c'était la nourriture des canuts, qui sont les anciens tisserands. Et comme ils n'avaient pas beaucoup de temps pour manger, ils faisaient juste du fromage battu avec des herbes, des choses comme ça, ils mangeaient que ça. Donc c'est le plat le plus typique qu'on peut trouver à Lyon. Ensuite, vous avez la charcuterie lyonnaise. Il y a 4 saucissons différents. Vous avez au milieu, on trouve que ça à Lyon, des gratons. Les gratons, c'est des morceaux de frits, oui, ce sont des morceaux de peau de cochon qui sont frits. Et là, vous avez un pâté de tête de cochon. Et à côté, on met toujours une salade de cervelas. Le cervelas, c'est un saucisson qui est pistaché, avec des pommes de terre, des croûtons et une sauce gribiche qui est servie chaude.
Et en plus, vous mangez des choses qu'on ne mange pas ailleurs. C'est vrai ça?
Les gens sont bêtes, ils ne savent pas ce qui est bon.
Oui.
C'est vrai. Comme notamment le tablier de sapeur.
Voilà.
Le tablier de sapeur, c'est la panse de bœuf qui est panée et ça n'a pas beaucoup de goût, mais c'est très lyonnais. C'est le plat de papy lyonnais.
Donc vous êtes bien d'accord avec ce que je vais dire, que Lyon c'est bien la capitale gourmande de la France?
Je crois, oui. Je crois que les Lyonnais sont des bons vivants, des personnes qui aiment bien s'attabler.
Ouais.
Et, où c'est une ville qui est en province, c'est pas comme Paris où c'est une ville de business.
Ouais.
À Lyon, c'est plus une ville de province et du coup, on a plus le temps de manger peut-être.
To an Englishman, the tastes of Lyon's delicacies are perhaps a little unsettling. But the Frenchman has always been willing to try new things. And that's what explains the popularity in France of apparently challenging dishes from his colonial empire, especially North Africa.
I've dined with French people who've quaked with terror when presented with an Anglo-Saxon style curry. But for the French, the wilder reaches of North Africa are not exotic at all. This is because they're actually still part of the French cultural imagination. The problem is they don't belong to France politically anymore. But this is just a detail of history that everybody seems to have conveniently forgotten.
Je suis malheureux.
In the 1960s, having suffered the bloody convulsions of 2 world wars, France's imperial might was first shaken, then stirred and then destroyed, when its former colonies demanded independence. When Algeria exploded, the French were completely unprepared. The ensuing War of Independence between 1955 and 1962 brought terrorism to the streets of Algiers and Paris. When, as France's wartime hero, President Charles de Gaulle put it, a handful of Muslim fanatics challenged the might of French majesty. When finally de Gaulle gave Algeria its independence in 1962, France was faced with an influx of Algerians and their colonisers known as the Pieds Noirs. Both communities flocked to Marseille, Lyon and Paris, often finding life here tougher than what they'd left behind. In a modest attempt to remember their homeland, they brought to these cities the smells and tastes of their cuisine. One of their greatest exponents is Fatima Al, Paris's best-known North African chef.
Donc vos premiers clients, c'était plutôt des Maghrébins qui avaient une nostalgie pour le vieux pays ou c'était des Français?
Très vite, c'était beaucoup plus des Européens, des Français particulièrement, des Européens, et aussi quelques Maghrébins qui ont réussi, qui peuvent venir au restaurant.
D'accord. Et est-ce que la gastronomie marocaine a changé la cuisine française, à votre avis?
J'étais à New York, chez Dean De Luca, et c'est marqué French couscous. Non, le couscous n'est pas français. Les Français ont tellement aimé le couscous que ça devient le premier plat préféré et mangé des Français.
Est-ce que vous croyez que la cuisine maghrébine, c'est quelque chose qui a aidé les Français à comprendre les autres cultures, qui a amélioré les situations par rapport au racisme, par exemple?
Je pense sincèrement que s'il y a un langage, c'est le langage de la cuisine et de la gastronomie. Quand on partage un repas, on se rapproche des autres. Et je pense que le fait d'avoir une cuisine qui plaît, évidemment, ça repousse le racisme. C'est très clair que si on veut maintenir le lien entre les civilisations et les populations, c'est grâce à la cuisine.
D'accord.
Fatima's dishes are without question delicious, but I'm not convinced that they have in any real way made French society any more harmonious. De Gaulle's France was caught between his vision of an ordered and paternalistic society and the tensions, dreams and desires of a 60s youth generation wanting to break free of the old order.
It's this state of near-anarchy that provoked de Gaulle's famous remark about the impossibility of ruling a country as diverse as France, a country that produces 300 cheeses. This is especially important here, where cheese has a political significance. Camembert, for example, is supposed to be the mark of the man of the left. Gruyere is supposed to be the mark of the man of the right. Actually, nobody knows why this is, except that Camembert's always available and always cheap, whereas Gruyere is always expensive, hard, and to my mind, always leaves a nasty taste in the mouth.
The right was the dominant force through the 60s and 70s. But what separated President Georges Pompidou from de Gaulle was that the younger man was driven by the desire to go forwards rather than backwards. In the 1970s, the country was undergoing a cultural revolution, with the government dementedly embracing everything new and futuristic. The fetish for the new even infected architecture. The architectural style of the Pompidou Centre, surely the ugliest building in Paris, is a perfect example of the perverse and arrogant belief that newness for its own sake is the supreme good.
Some have argued that this is what explains the fashion for so-called nouvelle cuisine, a minimalist technique perfected by the super chef Paul Bocuse. Actually, it's all just an exquisite form of culinary showing off. Brilliant virtuosity in the name of pure form.
I wanted to know more about this culinary minimalism that had gripped the French imagination in the 1970s, and so went in search of its master.
Alors, Monsieur Paul Bocuse, mais vous êtes considéré comme le père spirituel de la cuisine française.
Vous savez, j'ai 82 ans, donc c'est normal, donc c'est la vieillesse qui compte.
Et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire pour vous, le terme nouvelle cuisine?
Je vais vous expliquer. Nouvelle cuisine, c'est un mouvement qui date de 1969. Donc, vous voyez, 69, ça fait bientôt 38 ans. Et là, si vous voulez, j'avais créé une société qui s'appelle la Grande Cuisine Française. On était 12, les 12 3 étoiles de l'époque. Et un jour, on faisait des plats pour servir, c'est-à-dire pour le Concorde. Et on était sur le tarmac avec l'aéroport, et on était là tous les 12. Et il y a un rigot qui dit « Voilà la nouvelle cuisine française ».
Et il y a une phrase de Van Gogh qui est très importante pour vous.
Oui, d'ailleurs, elle est en bas de mon menu, comme il est difficile d'être simple.
Voilà. Vous pouvez expliquer ça.
C'est important, parce que si vous voulez, la simplicité, c'est peut-être ce qu'il y a de plus difficile. Mais pour faire la simplicité, il faut les meilleurs produits du monde. c'est des homards, c'est des frettes, des bois, c'est des volailles de Brest, le Beaujolais, les Côtes-du-Rhône, le Charolais, le poisson des lacs, d'Annecy, tout ça. C'est ça qui est important. Et s'il n'y a pas de bons produits, il n'y a pas de bonne cuisine.
D'accord. Est-ce que vous pouvez m'expliquer d'un plat typique de ce qu'on appelle la nouvelle cuisine? Comment ça s'est organisé?
C'était rien dans l'assiette, tout sur l'addition.
Ah oui, d'accord.
Ce qui est nouveau aujourd'hui est vieux demain.
D'accord, d'accord.
Donc c'est toujours... Mais c'est vrai, la nouvelle cuisine, il y a eu... ça a fait l'affaire des cuisiniers, et puis l'affaire des journalistes, parce qu'on en a parlé pour vous et dans le monde entier. Mais c'était ça. Finalement, ce qui compte, c'est d'avoir de bons produits.
Nouvelle cuisine, at its best, is like a direct hit to all your taste buds at once. As one critic put it, it's like a kiss from heaven. But essentially, it was a fad, covering over the brutal truth that by the 1970s, much of French cuisine had become tired, stale, and, well, a bit worn out. The unthinkable was happening. French food, or bouffe, had gone bad.
This is when the term malbouffe first entered the French language. At first, it referred to bad foreign food. Then it meant the noxious stuff the French housewives were buying in supermarkets. It was a sign of the times, everybody said, that old France was dead or dying. And no politician was going to save it now.
Even President François Mitterrand, an absolute ruler in the mould of Louis XIV, could do little to halt the tectonic shifts of the era and the primacy of the Anglo-American world in politics, culture and food. For many gastro-purists, the nail in the coffin came with those great American chefs, Ronald McDonald and Colonel Sanders. Paris and then the whole of France were invaded by KFC, McDonald's and its plucky Belgian cousin, Quick. But you could also argue that the French power to conquer has even left its mark on the McDonald's empire, as shown in Quentin Tarantino's classic film Pulp Fiction.
You know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Le Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know. I didn't go on a Burger King.
What Tarantino is picking up on here is how Le Big Mac has become assimilated into French culture, Frenchified even. This restaurant may look like a normal McDonald's from the outside, but inside it's a different world.
For one thing, you could also have a salad niçoise, a Petit Express, I don't know, a pain au raisin or a croissant. All of these are pleasures ignored or unknown to McDonald's audience of worldwide, non-French, global chavs.
By the 1990s, the French were embracing American culture in a way unimaginable only a few decades before. Today, France is the most profitable McDonald's market outside America. Meanwhile, traditional bistros and brasseries are closing down with a frightening rapidity. A crisis that was keenly felt even by France's top chefs, like the 3 Michelin-starred Pierre Gagné.
Alors, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire pour vous la phrase malbouffe?
Moi, je dirais que spontanément, je répondrais que c'est surtout le non-respect de règles élémentaires qui sont celles qui respectent la santé des gens.
D'accord.
Voilà. Plus que critiquer les restaurants rapides, ou c'est plutôt la vache folle, c'est plutôt des choses, l'élevage intensif de volailles. Pour moi, c'est ça plutôt.
Ouais. Est-ce qu'on peut parler d'une crise dans la cuisine française dans les années 80?
Moi, personnellement, j'ai vécu un moment difficile parce qu'effectivement, j'ai eu effectivement ma 3e étoile en 1993. Effectivement, le pays était un petit peu en crise. Donc c'est vrai que la restauration a un petit peu
peu souffert.
Donc, à votre avis, la cuisine française, c'est une partie toujours intégrale de l'identité française?
Ah ben, je crois. Non, ce qui aujourd'hui est différent, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, la cuisine, je dirais, moyen d'expression, peut-être moyen de développer un discours, je dirais, artistique. Il est plus français, il est anglais, il est espagnol, il est américain, il est danois, il est aujourd'hui dans le monde entier.
Oui, d'accord.
Fusion food has replaced nouvelle cuisine as the fad of the day. It's modern, it's multicultural, and it sells. You could also say that this fusion applies to France's current president, Nicolas Sarkozy, a man on a mission to drag France into the 21st century. Sarko, unlike his predecessors, is pro both the UK and the US and sees any future French success as reliant on both. These are countries led by hard-headed pragmatists, where cooking takes second place to commerce. For this reason, it's hard to imagine French cooks of Sarko's France dazzling the great heads of Europe in quite the way that Talleyrand's did. In some ways, Sarko is the anti-Mitterrand. He doesn't drink, he's a keen jogger, and worst of all, he's apparently indifferent to food. He didn't even have an inaugural banquet. All of this is, of course, deeply un-French, the very opposite of what Mitterrand or indeed Louis XIV stood for: power, glory, and the great food of the great nation. But don't worry, I'm not going to throw myself off the Eiffel Tower, even if Sarko's 21st century France is a world away from the country I first came to. This is a nation on its way to becoming lean, mean, and fit for business in the globalised world. You can see this everywhere, from the gleaming new skyscrapers at La Défense to the cosmopolitan life below. And most of all, you see it in the swift decline of the quality of French cuisine. There's literally no time to eat well in the fast-moving world of corporate hustle.
The story of French cuisine is that France was at its best, most democratic and well, most French, when the very best of food was available to everybody. From the Revolution to the Franco-Prussian War, from the Belle Époque to the Algerian War of Independence, you could almost measure the advances made in French democratic society by the production and the consumption of what was the very best food in the world. All of this was quite literally the Democratic Republic of France on a plate.